This video was brought to you by Nebula. On Monday, Russia pulled out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, a UN and Turkey-mediated deal that allowed Ukrainian grain to be exported via the Black Sea. While this didn't come as a complete surprise, given that the Kremlin had been complaining about the terms of the deal since last October, it's still bad news for global food security. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the deal, why Putin pulled out, and what might happen next. Before we start, TLDR EU is currently only just behind TLDR UK's subscriber count. So if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to this channel and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and help TLDR EU win the subscriber race. So let's start with a quick recap on the deal itself. Before the war, Ukraine was one of the world's largest agricultural producers, with it sometimes being nicknamed the breadbasket of Europe. Now, this is largely because Ukraine has the most arable land in all of Europe, excluding Russia. And before the war, Ukraine's food exports provided the calories to feed about 400 million people, with these exports accounting for something like 10% of the world's wheat, 16% of the world's maize, and roughly 50% of its sunflower oil. Now, if you look at a map, you might assume that Ukraine would export most of its produce to Europe. After all, Ukraine borders 4 EU states and has pretty good rail and road connections to its European neighbours. However, in part because of the EU's protective agricultural policies, Ukraine actually exported a lot of its produce to North Africa via the Black Sea, and more specifically from Odessa, which is usually responsible for about 98% of Ukrainian wheat exports. Unfortunately for Ukrainian farmers, though, the Russian Navy blockaded the Black Sea when the war began, and the Ukrainian army has mined the passages going in and out of the ports to deter a Russian naval assault. As such, in the first few months of the war, exports fell by 75%, and by April there was something like 20 million tons of produce just stuck in the country. Unsurprisingly, global food prices spiked, causing a global food crisis, which has been especially bad news for those North African countries that have previously relied on Ukraine's exports via the Black Sea. Now, this obviously irritated many poorer countries in the global south that Russia had previously tried to keep on its side of the war. As such, Russia quickly realized that starving their potential allies wasn't a good look. So in July of last year, with the help of Turkey and the UN, Ukraine and Russia agreed the Black Sea Grain Initiative. This initiative basically allowed Ukrainian farmers to export their grain via 3 ports on the Black Sea coast. Now, ships coming in and out of these ports will be subject to checks in the Turkish Straits by Turkish authorities, who made sure that they weren't using the ships to export or import weapons. Now, originally, the deal was a great success. Amazingly, in August and September, Ukraine exported nearly as much grain as it did pre-war via the Black Sea, despite the fact that Ukrainian farmers had already redirected some of their produce to be exported via its EU neighbours and the Danube River. All in all, though, Ukraine has exported something like 33 million tons of produce under the deal, mostly corn and wheat, which has not only helped Ukraine, but has also helped to bring down food prices from their dizzying heights last year. According to the UN Food Price Index, in the year or so since the grain deal came into place, global food prices have fallen by something like 25%, driven largely by an especially steep decline in vegetable oils, which is not coincidentally one of Ukraine's main exports. However, for the past few months, Russia's been complaining about the deal and threatening to pull out of it. Russia's main complaint here is about sanctions. Essentially, Russia claims that EU and US sanctions are making it difficult for Russia to export its own agricultural goods, especially fertilizer, via the Black Sea. Despite the fact that Western sanctions do have exemptions for Russian food and fertilizer, the Kremlin argues that sanctions targeting Russian individuals and its state agriculture bank, which has been expelled from the SWIFT banking system, are still hindering their exports. Now, the UN and EU did offer to carve out an exemption for a new special unit within the bank specifically for this purpose, but Russia said that it wasn't enough. On top of that, Putin's also argued that the grain isn't even going to the right places. But while it's true that nearly half of the Black Sea exports have been shipped to what the UN call high-income countries, because food is a global industry, any increase in global supply will bring down global costs, which is why the UN has described the deal as a lifeline for global food security. Anyway, despite Putin's concerns, Russia has extended this deal twice before. But on Thursday, Putin said that, quote, enough is enough, and Russia refused to extend the deal on Monday. Now, as I say, this isn't all that much of a surprise, given his previous complaints and the fact that Ukraine seemingly blew up the Crimean bridge on the same day. But it nonetheless sparks a wave of criticism from Ukraine and its allies. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken criticized Russia for using food as a weapon. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen described it as a cynical move, and the UN chief said that he deeply regrets Russia's decision. More worryingly for Russia, though, even China pushed back against Putin's decision, with the Chinese Foreign Ministry expressing hope that the deal would be continued. So what happens from here? Well, the first thing to say is that it's possible that this is just a bluff, and Russia might return to the deal in the near future. This is what happened in early November, when Erdogan successfully pressured Putin back to the deal after Russia withdrew for 48 hours. However, the good news is that even if Putin does withdraw for real this time, it's unlikely to have as acute an effect on global food prices as the original invasion did. While food prices did jump a bit on the news, with wheat prices spiking a couple of % even before Russia finally walked away, the deal had more or less ground to a halt. The Russian Navy had significantly stepped up its inspections, making them longer and more frequent, and blocked exports from one of the 3 ports originally included in the deal. Accordingly, the number of ships has fallen by about 1 per day, with only 1.3 million metric tons exported in May, and no new ships were registered under the deal. Instead, Ukrainian farmers have started exporting more via the Danube and via its EU neighbours. So Russia's withdrawal is likely to only accelerate this pre-existing trend. Perhaps the most interesting thing about Russia's decision here, though, is what it says about Putin's priorities. Putin signed up to the deal in the first place because he wanted to keep the global south on his side. And the fact that he's withdrawn from it suggests that he's no longer as worried about keeping up appearances as he was at the beginning of the war. Now, this could either be because Putin has accepted that he's just lost the international popularity contest, or because he's become more desperate to beat Ukraine by any means possible, and is now willing to reduce Ukraine's foreign currency inflows, even if that comes at a diplomatic cost. And there's a whole lot more happening around the world too. Ukraine might capture the headlines, but it's far from the only contemporary conflict. In fact, Real Life Law's Superb Modern Conflicts is a brilliant series which runs you through all kinds of ongoing and recent crises. Through this series' beautiful visuals and incredibly detailed research, you can learn about everything from the ongoing and troubling civil war in Ethiopia, which we've discussed a number of times on TLDR Global, the latest on the war in Ukraine, or how the rise of ISIS shook the Middle East.